I still remember the exact moment I stepped onto that land for the first time. No engines. No distant sirens. No voices drifting through the air. Just wind. Wind moving through open space like it had nowhere else to be. It was the kind of silence that slows your heartbeat without asking permission. The kind that makes you breathe deeper, without realizing you are. And standing there, looking across that empty stretch of earth, one thought settled into my mind with absolute certainty. This is freedom. I didn't buy that property to flip it. I didn't buy it as an investment strategy. I didn't buy it hoping property values would spike. I bought it for something much simpler. Control. Land that was mine. Space where no one could dictate how tall my fence could be. What color my house had to be. How short my grass needed to stay. And the best part? It was outside the HOA. Not inside. Not attached. Not governed. Not subject to rules, meetings, or surprise fees. The HOA neighborhood sat close by, perfectly arranged like a real estate brochure. Identical homes. Trimmed lawns. Matching mailboxes. Predictable symmetry. I respected it. But I didn't want it. I wanted distance. On paper, everything about my purchase looked flawless. In reality, there was one problem I hadn't fully grasped yet. There was no real road. Not an official one. There was a dirt path people had been using for years. That's it. No pavement. No maintenance. No guarantees. In dry weather, it kicked up dust so thick it followed you like a storm cloud. In rain, it turned into mud that swallowed tires whole. The first time I drove down it after closing the deal, I told myself, it's rough, but manageable. The second time? I wasn't so sure. Every dip felt deeper. Every rut felt intentional. My truck shook hard enough to make me question the entire purchase. That's when something hit me. Owning land means nothing if you can't reliably reach it. And unreliable access turns property into liability fast. That realization forced a decision. I had two options. Option 1. Use the HOA's roads. Paved. Smooth. Maintained. Connected directly to the main road. Convenient. Easy. But nothing with an HOA is ever just convenience. Using their roads meant paperwork. Permissions. Conditions. Fees. And once you accept even a small tie, you're no longer fully independent. Even if you're not officially a member, you're connected. Influenced. Accountable. Option 2. Build my own road. On my land. With my money. Under my responsibility. More expensive up front. More time. More work. No help. No applause. But clean. No strings attached. People told me I was overcomplicating it. Why waste money when the HOA road is right there? Just work something out. Don't be stubborn. But I've learned something over time. The easiest solution at the beginning often becomes the most expensive later. I didn't want favors. I didn't want temporary permissions. I didn't want future leverage hanging over my head. So I chose the hard route. And I did it properly. I hired licensed surveyors to mark exact property lines, not guesses, not assumptions. Precise measurements. Zero ambiguity. I pulled permits from the county. Met with inspectors. Verified drainage plans so nothing impacted neighboring land. Checked setback requirements. Followed regulations most people don't even realize exist. This wasn't just road construction. This was protection. When construction began, it felt surreal. Heavy machinery rolled in. Earth was carved. Gravel was layered, leveled, compacted. Slowly, something uncertain became solid. I stood at the edge of the property watching it take shape, thinking about how long that land had existed without real access. And now it was changing. When the road was finished, it wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. But it was strong. Straight. Reliable. Mine. The first time I drove on it, I didn't speed. I rolled forward slowly. Listening. Feeling. No slipping. No sinking. No doubt. For the first time since buying that land, access wasn't a question mark. One evening, I stood at the end of that road as the sun dropped low. And I felt something unexpected. Relief. I genuinely believed the difficult part was over. I thought I had solved the only real problem. I was wrong. A few weeks later, I opened my mailbox and saw a clean white envelope. Familiar logo. The HOA's logo. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe a neighborhood update. Maybe construction notice. I almost tossed it aside. Almost. Inside was a short letter. Professional. Polite. And in the center of the page was a number that made my chest tighten for a second. $300. Access and maintenance fee. I read it once. Then again. Then I actually laughed. Because I wasn't using their roads. I had just spent a small fortune building my own. So I set the letter down and shook my head. This has to be a mistake. What I didn't realize was that this small piece of paper wasn't a billing error. It was the beginning of something much bigger. And much uglier. At first, I genuinely believed that first HOA letter was just a clerical mistake. A typo. A misfiled address. Some automated billing system gone wrong. So I did what most reasonable people would do. I ignored it. No angry call. No defensive email. No dramatic response. Why would I? I had built a private road completely on my own land. I wasn't using their infrastructure. There was nothing to debate. At least that's what logic said. But HOAs don't run on logic. They run on compliance. And compliance runs on repetition. About a month later, I opened my mailbox again. Same white envelope. Same logo. Same return address. Different tone. Before I even opened it, I could feel it. This wasn't a reminder. It was escalation. Inside, the language had changed. Outstanding balance. Late fee applied. Payment deadline. Short sentences. Less warmth. More authority. It wasn't framed as a request anymore. It was framed as expectation. The letter stated that my property benefited from HOA infrastructure and was therefore subject to an access and maintenance assessment. That word stuck with me. Benefited. Not used. Not traveled on. Not accessed. Benefited. It was vague, intentionally vague. A word flexible enough to stretch around almost anything. I sat there holding the letter, and something clicked. This wasn't about pavement. It was about presumption. HOAs don't survive because they're always legally airtight. They survive because most people don't question them. They pay because arguing feels draining. They comply because official-looking paperwork creates just enough anxiety to make resistance uncomfortable. And for a moment, doubt crept in. What if I missed something? What if there was some obscure clause buried in county records? What if fighting this costs more than just paying $300? That's the real strategy. Keep the number low enough that resistance feels irrational. $300 isn't devastating. It's annoying. And annoyance makes people surrender quietly. But I kept thinking ahead. If I paid it once, it wouldn't stop there. Next year it would be recurring. Then an increase. Then a special assessment. Then maybe conditions attached. Suddenly I'd be financially connected to an HOA I never joined. That wasn't happening. So this time, I responded. Not emotionally. Not aggressively. Calm. Structured. Professional. I wrote an email explaining clearly. My property is not within HOA boundaries. I built a private road entirely on my own land. I do not access or use HOA roads. I attached documentation. County property maps, surveyor reports showing exact boundaries, photos of construction, permit approvals. No accusations. No threats. No sarcasm. Just facts. And I ended with a simple line. Please review the attached documents and confirm that this invoice has been issued in error. Then I hit send. And for the first time since this started, I felt confident. Facts win. Or at least they should. Their reply came 2 days later. 2 days. That was the first red flag. No one carefully reviews surveys, legal boundaries, and construction documentation in 48 hours unless they're not actually reviewing them. The response thanked me politely, acknowledged receipt of my documents, and then rejected everything. They stated that access was assumed based on proximity. They reiterated that my property benefited from community infrastructure. They declared the fees standard practice. And then came the sentence that changed everything. Payment is mandatory. Mandatory. That word shifts the situation. Mandatory implies authority. Authority implies legal backing. If they were wrong about that, they weren't just billing me. They were overstepping. I leaned back in my chair staring at the screen. This wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't administrative oversight. It was a power move. They weren't asking if they were correct. They were asserting that they were. That's when my mindset changed. I stopped thinking like a frustrated homeowner and started thinking like someone protecting himself. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I started researching. County records. Recorded easements. Subdivision plats. HOA bylaws. State property law. I wasn't searching for loopholes. I was searching for clarity. Because confidence doesn't create rights. Documentation does. The deeper I went, the clearer something became. Their certainty felt rehearsed. Pre-written. Like this wasn't the first time they had sent a similar letter. Which made me wonder. Were they relying on something I hadn't checked yet? Or were they relying on me never checking at all? That night, I sat at my desk longer than I expected. Scrolling through archived filings. Cross-referencing parcel numbers. Reviewing decades-old records. And somewhere between zoning maps and easement statutes, a quiet realization began forming. If they didn't have legal authority to charge me, then they were basing their confidence on assumption. And if they were basing their authority on assumption, that meant something even more serious. It meant they might be depending on access they never legally secured. I hadn't even looked into that yet. But the possibility was there. And the more I thought about it, the more the entire situation started to shift. Because if there was no recorded easement, if there was no written agreement, if there was no legal right-of-way, then this wasn't about me owing them money. This was about them quietly relying on something that didn't belong to them. And the moment someone relies on something without securing it, they're exposed. That's when I realized something important. They weren't just testing my compliance. They might have been testing my awareness. And awareness changes everything. I kept reading. Digging deeper. Searching older filings. And eventually, I found something. Or rather, I didn't find something. And that absence was louder than any document could have been. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was angry. Because something didn't sit right. That word, mandatory, kept replaying in my head like a challenge. So instead of lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I made coffee and went back to my desk. If they were so confident, there had to be a foundation behind it. And if there wasn't, I was about to find out. I started with the basics again. County deed records. Subdivision plats. Boundary maps. Everything was exactly where it should be. My parcel lines were clear. Clean. Undisputed. The HOA's boundaries stopped well before touching my land. That part was solid. So I moved deeper. Easements. Because that's where real authority hides. An easement is simple in concept, it's legal permission to use land you don't own. Roads don't magically become shared. Utilities don't cross property lines by assumption. There has to be documentation. Recorded. Filed. Traceable. If the HOA truly had the right to charge me for access, there had to be an easement somewhere in the records. I searched the county database. Nothing. I searched again using alternate parcel numbers. Still nothing. I changed keywords. Checked older archive filings. Nothing. At first, I thought maybe I was overlooking something. Maybe it was bundled inside a larger development agreement decades ago. Maybe it was recorded under a prior landowner. So I went further back. Years back. Then decades. And slowly, a pattern started becoming obvious. There was no recorded easement. Not hidden. Not implied. Not outdated. It simply didn't exist. I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. Because if there was no easement, then legally, no one had guaranteed access across my property. And that's when the second realization hit me. For years, HOA residents had been using a small section of my land as a shortcut. Not paved. Not official. Just a worn-down path created by repetition. I'd seen it. People walking dogs. Joggers cutting through. Occasionally even cars shaving time off their route. I never objected. I didn't care. It seemed harmless. But legally? Harmless doesn't equal permitted. Intolerance does not equal consent. The more I thought about it, the clearer the situation became. The HOA had never secured access because they never thought they needed to. The land had always been open. Always available. Always unchallenged. They assumed it would stay that way. And now those same people were sending me a bill. That irony wasn't lost on me. I kept reading state property statutes carefully. Without a recorded easement or written agreement, access across private land can be revoked. At any time. As long as it doesn't interfere with emergency regulations. That's when I understood the scale of what I was looking at. If I restricted that shortcut, it wouldn't just inconvenience one person. It would impact dozens. Morning routines. School runs. Delivery routes. Daily habits built over years. Suddenly, the $300 invoice didn't feel like leverage anymore. It felt like exposure. Because now I saw the real equation. They weren't charging me because they were strong. They were charging me because they were comfortable. Comfortable with assumption. Comfortable with silence. Comfortable with no one questioning paperwork. The moment they used the word mandatory, they escalated something that had been quietly tolerated for years. And that was their mistake. I printed everything. County maps. Archived plats. Statutes. Highlighted sections explaining easement law. I organized it neatly into a folder. Not for drama. Not for intimidation. Just readiness. Because people who rely on assumption rarely back down easily. Sure enough, 2 days later, I received another message. But this time, it wasn't another invoice. It was an invitation. The HOA board requested a meeting to discuss the matter. That wording mattered. They didn't say enforce. They didn't say collect. They said discuss. Discussions happen when certainty fades. I agreed to attend. Not to argue. Not to negotiate. But to observe. I arrived early. Small room. Neutral walls. Long folding table. Chairs arranged evenly. The kind of place where decisions get recorded in meeting minutes no one reads. Board members entered gradually. Polite smiles. Measured handshakes. Calm voices. They looked confident. But confidence without documentation is fragile. The conversation began exactly as expected. They spoke about community cooperation, shared responsibility, maintaining neighborhood harmony. Then they brought up the unpaid fee. That's when I placed the folder on the table. Not aggressively. Just deliberately. The room went quiet for a moment. I opened it slowly. Slid forward the first document. County boundary map. Then another. Then another. And then I asked a question so simple it couldn't be redirected. Can you show me where your easement is recorded? Silence. Eyes shifted. Someone adjusted papers. Another cleared their throat. Finally, one board member mentioned long-standing use. I nodded. Then replied calmly. Long-standing use doesn't create legal access. You could feel the air change. Because now the conversation wasn't about collecting a fee. It was about defending something they never legally secured. One board member tried reframing it as cooperation. Another mentioned fairness. Fairness is often introduced when authority weakens. I slid forward the highlighted state statute. Read the relevant sentence out loud. No recorded easement means no guaranteed right-of-way. The tone of the meeting shifted instantly. One of them leaned forward and asked carefully. So what are you saying? I answered plainly. I'm saying I don't owe this fee. And I'm saying the assumption of access across my land isn't supported by law. That's when they asked the real question. Are you threatening to block access? I shook my head. I'm not threatening anything. I'm explaining reality. Reality doesn't shout. It just exists. They asked why I hadn't objected before. I told them the truth. I didn't mind. Until I was billed for something they didn't own. That changed the context. The friendly tone dissolved. Now they were asking practical questions. What would happen if access changed? How many residents used that path? Were there alternatives? I didn't answer those. Not because I didn't know. Because it wasn't my responsibility to solve a problem they never formally addressed. Finally, someone asked. So what do you want? I leaned back slightly and chose my words carefully. I want the invoices withdrawn. Written confirmation that I owe nothing. An acknowledgement that my property is not subject to HOA authority. No threats. No drama. Just boundaries. The meeting ended without resolution. No agreement. No raised voices. Just tension. As I walked out, I could feel something had shifted. They weren't confident anymore. They were calculating. Because now they understood something clearly. This wasn't about $300 anymore. It was about risk. And risk changes behavior. A few days passed after that meeting. No emails. No invoices. No legal threats. Just silence. But silence can mean two things. Confidence, or calculation. Then my phone rang. It was the HOA's property manager. Her voice sounded different this time. Softer. Careful. Measured. She said the board wanted to resolve the situation amicably. That word again. Amicably. Interesting how language changes when authority starts to thin out. She explained that the board had reviewed the matter further. They acknowledged that my property was technically outside HOA boundaries. They mentioned the invoice may have been issued based on assumed access. Assumed. Not legal. Not documented. Assumed. But they still hadn't said the one sentence that actually mattered. You don't owe this. Instead, they suggested finding a mutually beneficial arrangement. I didn't respond immediately. Silence had worked well so far. That evening, I walked down the length of the road I built. Gravel compressed solid beneath my boots. Straight. Dependable. Independent. This road existed because I chose the difficult option months earlier. If I had taken the easy path, signed something, used their infrastructure, none of this leverage would exist. The next morning, I replied to their email. Short, clear, professional. I thanked them for reviewing the situation. I reiterated that I did not agree to any arrangement involving fees or implied obligations. And then I stated exactly what I wanted. Written confirmation that all invoices were withdrawn, confirmation that my property is not subject to HOA authority, no future billing. That was it. No mention of access. No mention of shortcuts. No threats. Just clarity. A few hours later, my phone rang again. Same property manager. Now the tone was even more cautious. She said the board was concerned about future misunderstandings. That phrase told me everything. They weren't worried about collecting money anymore. They were worried about losing something they never officially controlled. She asked gently, "Do you intend to restrict access across your property?" There it was. The real issue. I paused. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because pauses matter. I haven't needed to, I said. And that was true. We ended the call politely. 2 days later, another email arrived. Short. Direct. The board had voted to withdraw the invoice. My account balance was zero. No further fees would be assessed. No apology. No explanation. Just confirmation. On the surface, it looked resolved. But I understood something deeper. They hadn't suddenly become reasonable. They had calculated risk. And the risk wasn't worth $300. That meant access was worth far more. Over the next week, I started noticing small changes. Less foot traffic on the shortcut. Joggers hesitating. People slowing down before stepping onto my land. No public announcement had been made. But word spreads quickly in neighborhoods. Uncertainty travels faster than email. And uncertainty changes behavior. I didn't confront anyone. Didn't post signs. Didn't say a word. I just observed. And that's when it became obvious. The shortcut wasn't just convenient. It was relied upon. Parents shaved minutes off school mornings. Delivery drivers used it automatically. Residents had built daily routines around land they didn't own. Habits feel permanent until they're questioned. That's when I made the next decision. Not out of anger. Not revenge. Out of clarity. If access was going to exist, it would be intentional. Not invisible. Not assumed. I called a contractor. Nothing dramatic. Nothing aggressive. Just something simple. Functional. Quiet. He walked the property line with me. We discussed placement. Measurements. Material. Practical details. As he finished taking notes, he asked casually, "Gate locked or unlocked?" I paused. Because that decision mattered. A locked gate is confrontation. An unlocked gate is awareness. Unlocked, I said. He nodded like he understood exactly what that meant. The installation was scheduled for the following week. And when that gate went up, everything changed. Not because it blocked anyone, but because it made reality visible. It wasn't tall. Wasn't threatening. Neutral metal. Clean lines. Set neatly at the edge of my property where the shortcut began. From a distance, it looked almost harmless. But psychologically, it was massive. For years, people had walked that path without thinking. It wasn't my land in their minds. It was just space between destinations. The gate interrupted that illusion. The first person who approached it slowed down. Looked around. Opened it carefully. Walked through. They hadn't done anything wrong. But now they felt something. Awareness. By afternoon, fewer people used it. Some reached the gate, hesitated, and turned back. By the next day, usage dropped even more. Not because they were stopped. Because they were reminded. This wasn't public. This wasn't guaranteed. This belonged to someone. A locked barrier creates conflict. An unlocked one creates reflection. Within a week, the shortcut was nearly empty. People adjusted faster than I expected. Routes changed. Routines shifted. No angry notes. No confrontation. Just adaptation. Then the HOA called again. This time, a board member. His voice was careful. Measured. He said residents had been asking questions about the gate. He wanted to understand my intentions. Intentions. That word again. I haven't changed anything, I replied. The land has always been private. Silence on the line. He asked if I plan to restrict access further. I haven't needed to, I said again. That answer frustrated him. Because you can't argue against someone who isn't angry, isn't threatening, and isn't demanding. He then asked if I'd consider formalizing access through an agreement. And that was the confirmation. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about losing something they had never legally secured. I'm not interested in agreements at this time, I said. Not never. Just not now. The call ended politely. And after that? Nothing. No letters. No meetings. No pressure. Just silence. Weeks passed. The gate stayed unlocked. The shortcut stayed mostly unused. And something subtle shifted. Before this, I was invisible to them. Just the landowner next door. Now, they were careful. Careful not to assume. Careful not to overstep. Careful not to push. Because they had learned something. Authority only exists where it's supported. Assumptions collapse when someone checks the paperwork. One evening, I stood near the gate as the sun dropped low. A couple approached from the HOA side. They slowed. Looked at the gate. Then turned around without touching it. They didn't look angry. They looked thoughtful. And that told me everything. This wasn't punishment. It was a lesson. A quiet one. The kind that lasts. Months passed. No new invoices. No threats. No meetings. The HOA never tried to revive the fee. It was over. At least on paper. But the interesting part wasn't dramatic victory. It was the subtle shift. People still used the neighborhood. Kids played. Neighbors chatted. Life continued. But something had changed. The shortcut was no longer invisible. The gate reminded everyone of boundaries. Not angrily. Not aggressively. Just clearly. Access existed, but it wasn't automatic. One afternoon, I was checking the hinges of the gate. Routine maintenance. Nothing special. As I worked, a man from the HOA side approached. He stopped a few feet away. Not confrontational. Not defensive. Just observing. He nodded toward the gate and said casually, "Well, I guess that's your road." Simple sentence. No accusation. No sarcasm. Just acknowledgement. And in that moment, I understood that the situation was truly finished. Because when someone acknowledges reality instead of arguing with it, the conflict ends. The HOA never sent another invoice. No revised billing. No follow-ups disguised as community notices. Silence. Recognition. Practical adjustment. Looking back, the most important lesson wasn't about HOAs. It wasn't about gates or roads. It was about proof. When authority claims something, two questions matter. Do they actually have the legal right? Are you willing to ask for evidence? Most people pay because paperwork looks official. They avoid confrontation because it feels exhausting. $300 seems small. Not worth the fight. But principles don't disappear when ignored. They resurface later, often at higher cost. If I had paid that first invoice, the story would have ended quietly. No meetings. No documentation. No boundaries. I would have become financially tied to an organization I never joined. Instead, it ended with clarity. Ownership. Defined limits. A road built on my terms. Not to start conflict. Not for attention. But for independence. The gate remains there today. Unlocked. Functional. A quiet symbol. Not of defiance. But of understanding. Access is never automatic. Authority requires documentation. And assumptions collapse when someone simply asks. Show me where that's written. HOAs often feel powerful because most people never challenge them. Not because they are always right. But because compliance is easier. However, ease doesn't equal correctness. And silence isn't consent. This story isn't about defeating an HOA. It's about recognizing boundaries. If you ever receive a demand that doesn't feel right, a rule that lacks explanation, or a bill that relies more on assumption than evidence, pause. Read. Ask. Verify. Because confidence without documentation is just opinion. An opinion doesn't override rights. I didn't build that road for drama. I built it for freedom. Freedom to decide. Freedom to set boundaries. Freedom to require proof. In the end, that is what mattered. Not victory. Not confrontation. But clarity. And clarity is powerful.